But you could ask many people when it comes to the Berlin Conference, who did the Congo go to? And many people say, well, the Congo went to Belgium. Yes and no. The Congo went to a Belgian citizen, but it did not go to the country Belgium. It went to King Leopold II. I want you to understand this. The country, the Congo, in Central Africa, was the private property of one man for 23 years, from 1885 at the Berlin Conference all the way up to 1908. King Leopold II. King Leopold II of Belgium formally acquired rights to the Congo territory from the colonial nations of Europe in 1885 at the Berlin Conference and declared the land his private property, naming it the Congo Free State. From 1885 to 1908, his colonial military forces forced the local population to produce rubber and committed widespread atrocities. And in 1908, Leopold was forced to cede the territory to become a Belgian colony. Now, this man here committed so many crimes against humanity in Africa that it is said that King Leopold of Belgium killed more Africans than Hitler killed Jews. And we look at Africa in 2023 and 2024 and talk about the coups and the revolutions and the uprisings and the insurrections without taking note of the link to European countries who are proxy power brokers, trying to take control of the wealth in all those countries. Recently, we did a program here on Gael TV about Chad, Ivory Coast, Mauritania, the Sudan, the so-called coup belt in Africa, all of the French-speaking countries who still have so many foreign investors and transnational and multinational corporations trying to extract the wealth and destabilizing the region politically and supporting those who are involved in revolutions and coups to open up the way for Europe. Well, King Leopold of Belgium established these atrocities where he would cut off hands and cut off feet of Africans who did not collect enough rubber. But that wasn't the first time that an atrocity like that was committed, because you had Christopher Columbus who did the same thing in the Dominican Republic. He would cut off the hands of those who did not collect enough gold dust. So King Leopold set up concentration camps. There was rape, there was torture, there was starvation. And he was seen as a hero to his people. And what he established in the Congo remains at the root of the crisis that is there today. So the Congo, fast forwarding, achieved independence from Belgium on June 30th, 1960, and was immediately confronted by a series of secessionist movements and the assassination of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba and the seizure of power by Mobutu Sese Seko in a 1965 coup. Of course, Mobutu was a criminal to many African people, but a hero to the Europeans. How is that so? Now, in the last Malcolm X speech that was done on February 19, 1965, he spoke about Patrice Lumumba and about Mobutu and the European interference in African nations and the way that these resources are manipulated and political puppets are chosen and selected to do the will and the bidding of European powers that were trying to get the wealth. Most of the 100,000 Europeans in the Congo who had remained behind after independence fled the country when Patrice Lumumba came into power, opening the way for Congolese to replace the European military and administrative elite. And after the United Nations rejected Lumumba's call for help to put down the secessionist movements, Lumumba asked the Soviet Union for assistance, who accepted and sent military supplies and advisors. This is where the proxy war begins. I also recently, right here on Gael TV, did programs about apartheid in South Africa, about the Rwanda genocide, which is also linked to the Belgians, and the Angolan Civil War, 1975 to 2002, where you had Europeans on either side like puppet masters controlling politicians. And Patrice Lumumba was a man that they could not control. And when all of these same movements to try to overthrow his government, who was supported by America and Europe, when he asked for help to battle these movements that are trying to topple his government, to destabilize his country, America and Europe said no, but Russia said yes. Always be careful when your enemy tries to pick your friends, because Russia has always been much closer to Africa and has had a much more sincere interest in Africa than Western Europe and America has had. So on September the 14th, Colonel Joseph Mobutu, with the backing of the United States and Belgium, removed Patrice Lumumba from office. And on January 17, 1961, Lumumba was handed over to the authorities and executed by Belgian-led troops. A 2001 investigation, though, by Belgium's parliament found Belgium as a country and its government and its leadership morally responsible for the murder of Patrice Lumumba, and the country has since officially apologized for its role in his death. Think about it. Patrice Lumumba was killed in 1960. And in 2001, 40 years later, the Belgian parliament holds a hearing, and 40 years later they admit, okay, yes, we were responsible for the murder of Patrice Lumumba and many of the problems that followed afterwards. And they formally apologized. It would have taken a very long period of campaigning for them to get to that point. And when Patrice Lumumba was executed, of course, Joseph Mobutu, Joseph was the name that they like to call him by, took control. Mobutu had the staunch support of the United States because of his opposition to communism. The United States believed that his administration would serve as an effective counter to communist movements in Africa. A single-party system was established, and President Mobutu declared himself head of state, and he periodically held elections in which he was the only candidate. Now, this is one of the main players in this picture, because there are really three key individuals. And remember, I'm talking about the world's biggest and most forgotten humanitarian crisis in 2023. The Congo, and the atrocities there that started with King Leopold II, that a great liberator came into office, Patrice Lumumba, when they became independent in 1960. And then he is assassinated with the backing of Joseph Mobutu, who was supported by America, because they were concerned and have always been concerned about the relationship between Africa and Russia, in the same way that they're concerned about the relationship between Africa and China. And Mobutu was their man. Whereas Patrice Lumumba established a close relationship with Russia, who said, we will help you maintain your legitimate authority. America has refused. Russia, or Belgium and France have refused. Europe has refused. But Russia said, we will help. Then Mobutu comes in, and Mobutu says, I will support America and Europe, and I can be relied on to fight against Russian influence, communist influence in Africa. Now, by the late 1967, Mobutu had successfully neutralized his political opponents and rivals, either through co-opting them in his regime, arresting them, or rendering them otherwise politically impotent. Throughout the late 1960s, Mobutu continued to shuffle his governments and cycle officials in and out of the office to maintain control. And by the late 1970s, Mobutu was attempting to assert Zaire as a leading African nation. So, of course, Mobutu renamed the country to Zaire. And he was this darling of America. America felt we can fight against Russia through this African puppet who, one, killed his own brother, but two, is willing to represent our interests to his own African people. So Europe often links with political puppets in Africa to ensure that they retain control over Africa's wealth and mineral resources, even if it means massive destabilization and widespread bloodshed. Now, beloved, let me show you some proof in images of this relationship between a corrupt leader of the Congo, who in many ways continued the European stranglehold that was established by King Leopold II of Belgium from 1885 to 1908, who committed so many crimes against humanity and atrocities and genocide against African people. Here, they were able to assassinate Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the Congo, and install an African leader who will support them, President Mobutu. Here, Mobutu is with President Richard Nixon, United States President in the early 1970s. Here he is, a guest at the White House. Here he is again with President Richard Nixon, President Mobutu, guest at the White House. But not just with Nixon, also President Jimmy Carter. Mobutu, the African leader in the center of Africa, who is representing American interests, just like the Shah of Iran, prior to Ayatollah Khomeini, a leader in the Middle East who can represent America's interests. They're going to give him weapons, they're going to give him resources, they're going to give him money, they're going to boost up his military. But not only was Mobutu invited by President Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter, but also President Ronald Reagan. Look at how long he's been in office. And he was also invited to the White House by President Ronald Reagan. But not just Reagan. Here, President Mobutu of the Congo is a guest of President George Bush. Now remember, he was president of the Congo throughout all of that time. Meanwhile, the Cold War is taking place between America and Russia. Russia has a close relationship with many of the African countries. America wants to fight against Russia. But they have their puppet in the middle of Africa. And they say, we can fight Russia through him. And so whether it was Richard Nixon or Jimmy Carter or President Ronald Reagan or President George H. Bush, he remained a close friend and a close ally throughout that entire period. Look at it. With the backing of the United States, corruption became so common in Zaire, which was renamed, that they came up with this term Zairean sickness, meaning gross corruption, theft, and mismanagement. And this term, Zairean sickness, was coined reportedly by Mobutu himself. International aid, most often in the form of loans, enriched Mobutu while he allowed national infrastructure, such as the roads, to deteriorate as little as 1/4 of what had existed in 1960 when Patrice Lumumba came into power. Zaire became a kleptocracy as Mobutu and his associates embezzled government funds. And he did all of this in the Congo under the watchful eye of the United States of America, with the support, with the backing for as long as he was the head of a country in the middle of Africa, and for as long as he was willing to fight against Russia, the communists, ideologically, and support America. They did not care how corrupt he was. Mobutu allegedly stole as much as $4 to $5 billion US while in office. He was not the first corrupt Congolese leader by any means. And government as a system of organized theft goes back to King Leopold II. This was a system established by a European leader, a Belgian king, who set up a government of private property, where any wealth that went into that treasury belonged to him. And he continued. And Belgium, through their proxy governments and their colonial control, continued in the Congo with this kind of system whereby whatever wealth the country generates becomes the personal property of a handful of white people. In July 2009, and listen to this, a Swiss court determined that the statute of limitations had run out on an international asset recovery case of about $6.7 million of deposits of Mobutu in a Swiss bank, and therefore the assets should be returned to the Mobutu family. Imagine that. They say, yeah, he stole billions, but statute of limitations has passed. We're going to give the money back to him or his family after he had died. President Mobutu renamed the Congo Zaire in 1971, and he was overthrown in 1997.